Thank you, Max. Good morning, everybody. It is Wednesday, June 2nd, 2021. This is a virtual meeting of the Wilmington, Baltimore Avenue Streetscape Task Force. I'd like to welcome everybody and call this meeting to order at 9:01 a.m. I'd like to start off with roll call, and I'm going to call a name. I'm going to identify your affiliation because I think it's helpful for everybody to know who you represent and what your affiliation is. Correct me if I get something wrong or omit something. And as I call your name, I would appreciate you raising your hand and holding it up for a few seconds so that it can be recorded and easier to identify everybody. With that, we'll do roll call. Jenny Burton, owner and landlord, the shops at 33 Baltimore and the shops at Rehoboth Muse. Welcome, Jenny.
Morning,
Frank
President.
Cole, owner of Atlantic Cycles, Sea Change, and also Bob's Bikes.
Good morning.
Are you there? There you are, Frank. Welcome aboard. Frank Cooper, resident. Welcome, Frank. Daniel Fosnot, manager, Oceanus Motel.
Good morning.
Welcome, Daniel. Randy Haney, owner, Blue Moon Restaurant.
Good morning.
Good morning, Randy. Thank you. Patty Hoffman, owner of Stitch Thatch on North First Street.
Hi there, I'm here.
Hi, thank you, Patty. David Mariner, executive director of Camp Rehoboth. There he is. He's muted, but he's there. Andy Medic, owner, Sea Change Vacation Rentals. I don't see him on yet. Howard Menaker, resident.
Good morning, Mayor.
See you there. Thank you, Howard. Alex Moore, partner of the Avenue Inn, Beachview Hotel, property ownership on Wilmington Avenue. Welcome, Alex. Elise Moore, not related to Alex Moore. I just want to confirm that. And she is an owner of the Admiral Hotel. Welcome, Elise. Bob Pomerantz, owner of Brighton Suites and also owner of Hunt and Lane retail shop on second block of Wilmington. Are you there, Bob? Not on yet. Joe Baker, owner of Henlopen City Oyster House and Blue Hen Restaurants.
Hello.
Hi, Joe. Welcome aboard there. So we're missing a few. I'd also like to call roll call for the commissioner, Commissioner Ed Stranowski, who's representing Main Street.
Good morning, Mayor.
Good morning, Ed. Commissioner Pat Caluzzi, representing the city's Street and Transportation Committee and Parking Task Force.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning, Pat. And Mayor Stan Mills here, of course. So we have a quorum. We're able to formally conduct business, take votes if needed. I'd also like to introduce our ex officio members, the project team, City Manager Sharon Lynn, Keith Banks, Chief of Police, Kevin Williams, Director of Public Works, Max Hamby, IT Director, and who else is here? Evan Miller, our Project Coordinator and Parking Department Representative. And Mark Larson are doing our secretary today for us. Welcome, everybody. Again, it takes a lot of people to put on these meetings. We appreciate your time commitment and participation. I'd also like to welcome everybody that's watching virtually and to personally thank those participants who pre-registered to be able to participate. We will obviously call on you at appropriate times during the meeting to garner your feedback, and that's appreciated. Those members of the public pre-registered include Mike Strange. He's a citizen. He's also an expert in wireless and was a planner for DelDOT. Rick Perry, citizen, and also the former Planning Commission chair for the city. Dr. Trejos is on today. Or should be on when we call on him. And he has expertise in the wireless field and also, I believe, undergrounding. So welcome to all those. We'll be calling on you at appropriate time. Support documents are embedded in the agenda as they are available. And that includes correspondence, we'll get to in a minute. I'd also like to make just a little note that I have to get out agendas 1 week ahead of time. So that means today I need to get out the agenda for next week's meeting. And so sometimes there's a little challenge in getting the agenda together, and I might not know everything to put on there, so I take a stab at it the best I can. As far as approval of minutes, this was a short week in a quick time frame. They are not yet ready. We'll see if we can shoot for 1 or 2 sets of minutes to approve at our next meeting on January 9th. With that, we'll go to correspondence. Again, it's embedded in the agenda. We received 2 pieces of correspondence from Mike Strange, and they're embedded. Also, correspondence from Dr. Michael Trejos, including a presentation that are all seem to be fairly self-explanatory, and we welcome those and thank you. With that, we're going to go to old business. Again, I didn't know where we were going to be at when I created the agenda a week ago, so I put this on their status of seeking engineering consultant knowledgeable in the undergrounding of utilities. I don't know, Sharon, have we made any progress on that, or?
Yes, we've signed on with a business company that we've been using for other avenues here, and they're at least getting the information together for what we need.
Very good. So we've got somebody on board. So I guess in that terms, we know that Rossi has presented some information on undergrounding. You've just heard we've hired a consultant that's an expert in undergrounding. They can work together to feed us information. You'll note that in the correspondence we received, there's a lot of mention of undergrounding. I don't really intend to do a lot of talking about undergrounding today until we hear more from our experts, and I think that is reasonable. With that, we're going to go to the major portion of old business, which is to discuss the draft schematics developed by Rossi Group and presented to us at the last meeting. The schematics retain the general roadway circulation and layout to improve pedestrian sidewalk areas, safety, and circulation. And our goal today is to target selection of a desired schematic or schematics, plural, for further development by the Rossi Group. I intend for us to have discussion today, to absorb the information, to listen to each other, contemplate, but I don't really intend to vote. If we get that far, that would be fine. But I'd really like us to take this time to do a lot of thinking, and then have a week to think before we come back to our June 9th meeting and rediscuss things and conduct formal votes. So we'll see where we get today. There's a lot on our plate, and I sent out a support document giving a suggestion for an approach to this. If anybody else has any comments during the meeting, then please speak up. We'll entertain your direction that you'd like to go. In my approach, I suggested that we determine the desired width of the travel lane first, and then that we determine the extent of bicycle accommodations or bicycle facilities, determine the extent of parking, and go from there, looking at each of the elements there. If you look at your, let me see. Just a reminder, we're going to be looking at concepts, 3 types of schematics. Concept 1A focuses on enhanced pedestrian circulation. Concept 1B focuses on enhanced pedestrian circulation plus bicycle circulation. And concept 2 focuses on enhanced vehicular access. Just to remind everybody that this compilation I have embedded in the agenda is really just a reiteration of portions of the Rossi presentation of last week. Their presentation, 77 pages, and I condensed it to less than a quarter of that. So you still may need to refer back. The minimum 5-foot pedestrian circulation width is what Rossi is suggesting. less than the desired width of 8 feet. The consistent travel width of 10 feet is their recommendation. And each schematic maximizes the rights of way to accommodate streetscape elements. What we'd like to do is perhaps we can bite off something easy here to start with, looking at our streetscape elements, the travel lanes, the through lanes, the absolute minimum is 9 feet, and then you'll see in all of the proposed schematics by Rossi, they have a minimum recommendation of 10 feet. By example, concept 1A, Baltimore Avenue, they have, again, the minimum 10-foot through lane. Again, this could be the absolute minimum of 9 feet, but they're proposing 10 feet. I would like to suggest that as a committee, we somewhat agree, at least initially, that 10 foot is the agreed upon minimum thorough lane. Is there any discussion on the thorough lane width? I can't see anybody when I share the screen, so you're going to need to just speak up unless I take it off the screen.
Mayor,
Yeah, and what I'd like you to do is just state your name, and so we can recognize you.
it's Alex. Curious, what did we end up with, right? What's the narrowest point with the new construction there on Lake, by where the parking on each side? I think that'd probably give us an idea of, it's pretty tight through there. So I'm just curious, what is that width? Do we know from the parking space to parking space and what the through lane is? Do you know where I'm speaking of? Kind of by the new park?
Are you
Bad
talking
Hair
about
Day.
Lake Avenue between Bad Hair Day and Cultured Pearl?
Well, if you're going, so the new construction, the drive lanes, if you're leaving, or if you're heading towards, Bad Hair Day, going up that street with the new park that's on the right there, that lane gets really narrow. So I'm trying to get an idea of how wide that is, if we know. Does that make, you follow me where I'm talking of, speaking of?
Along the hotel?
Yeah, basically, in front of Breakers there, and on the opposite side, if you're going, I guess it's west.
Where it has currently a single through lane with parking,
Correct.
parallel parking on both sides.
Right.
We're looking that up.
Any idea how wide that is?
Yeah, we're looking that up, Alex.
Okay, thank you.
Is that Third and Lake?
Say that again, Pat.
Is that
I think we
Third
call it
and
error.
Lake?
Third and Lake.
I think it's, well,
Yeah, so if you're
In
coming
that-
off a second, you're right. Yeah, and going up Third, I guess towards Third, right? If you're coming out the back of the parking lot in front of the city parking lot and Bad Hair Day was on your left, if you made that right on that new construction, or if you were going out of town, as I'd say, and you're heading towards the old Bad Hair Day, new Bad Hair Day, right there at your park, Pat.
Right.
Right. I think you addressed that before.
I shouldn't call it your park, Pat, but you helped get it done.
10, 11, or 12 feet, I think.
I'm finding it. So just move on.
We'll come back to that, Alex. We're looking into the plans right now.
Okay, just I thought it'd be a good reference because it feels narrow to me.
Right. While he's looking that up, I'd just like to make mention, obviously everybody's studied these, and I appreciate you doing some homework. We're looking at the through lanes now. The other components would be a potential bike lane. Here, another component is the pedestrian circle, circulation path, i.e. sidewalk area. This first concept is interesting because it has a 7-foot no man's land there. And I guess the interesting thing to point out there is that 7 foot is not being utilized for anything now. In theory, it could be combined with the 8-foot pedestrian path and have a 15-foot sidewalk if we wanted. That 7 foot could also become a 5-foot bicycle lane if we wanted, and the extra 2 feet could be added to the 8-foot pedestrian circulation path to make 10 feet. So you've got different combinations. Even though we've got 3 concepts in front of us, 1A, 1B, and 2, there are some hybrid opportunities.
Mayor, the travel lane on that section of Maryland between Bad Hair Day and Second Street, the travel lane is 12 feet wide and 2 8-foot parking spaces, one on each side.
So the travel lane there, I think it's very deceptive. You've got parallel parking on each side, so it makes it look like that is very narrow there, which is perception, obviously. But 12-foot center. Now, if you look at, be sure to look at the existing conditions on, let's see if I can find those. Existing conditions on Baltimore. Right now, up near with your back to Second Street, looking toward the ocean on Baltimore, you recall we've got 2 through lanes. We've got parallel parking on the left and parallel parking on the right. And per the existing conditions, it shows that there are 2 9-foot through lanes, and then 7-foot parking lanes there. So just to try to give you a perspective of what a 9-foot travel lane is.
Mayor,
Yes.
this is Howard Menaker.
Howard.
Given what we've just been told about the existing on Lake Avenue and the drawings, I would suggest that we adopt as a concept that the desirable width of any travel lane that we're considering would be 11 feet, but that 10 feet would be acceptable if we decide that we need parking, or we need a bike lane, or we need a wider pedestrian area. And I think that may happen in some blocks, but not others. But just as an operating concept, I would think if that's 12 feet on Lake Avenue now, then we would call our desired minimum 11 feet.
Any further comment?
Yes, Mayor. Frank Cooper.
Yes, sir. Go ahead, Frank.
I would really opt for leaving at the Baltimore Avenue near First Street has narrow lanes, but I would opt for leaving them the way they are and widening and using any excess space, should there be any, for widening sidewalks as opposed to widening car travel. I mean, it's tight there, but we've been living with it for decades, and the pedestrian access and overall aesthetics are the goal of this task force. So that's my 2 cents on that. Thank you.
I would like to remind everybody of our discussion that was passed on to Rossi, probably at one of the earliest meetings, and that was about the concern for turning radiuses at where Baltimore and Wilmington both intersect with Second Street. Whether you're turning off of Baltimore or Wilmington on the Second, or from Second onto either of those streets. And how they may react to that is just withdraw. If we go with parking on either side, one or both sides, Rossi may determine to just eliminate parking for the first dozen, 2 dozen, 3 dozen feet from Second Street. So keep that in mind. Patrick, I'm fine, or Howard, I'm fine with doing the 10-foot or 11-foot as an initial start here, and so that we can move forward. Anybody else would like to comment?
Yeah, Mr. Mayor, Frank Cole.
Yes, Frank.
I'm a little bit concerned about the idea of widening the pedestrian walkways at the expense of wider streets. If we're not going to do bike lanes, it would seem to me that the wider streets would be more conducive to people on bicycles. You narrow the streets, and Alex brought up the example of the new construction over there on Lake Avenue. You narrow the streets, and it creates, I think, friction between cyclists and motorists potentially. So I'd like to see maybe some discussion of going a little bit wider than 11 feet if it's possible.
Okay. Anybody else?
Yes. Oh.
Yes, Frank.
Frank Cooper.
Yeah, Frank Cole's point is interesting, and I ride my bike all the time, but honestly, there isn't really much cars passing bicycles on those blocks. It's already tight, and the idea of the Shero where the bicycles are integrated with traffic as opposed to being off to the side and passing is probably a better concept than to try to accommodate essentially a bike lane there. I just don't think there's the room for that. I mean, I'm all for allowing access for large vehicles in the corner, but the only part we're really talking about, the constriction, is really near Second Avenue. As the street tapers, it becomes really tight down there. And I really think that if it's kind of best left alone, other than maybe moving parking spaces back a little bit so that vehicles can turn there. And that's my 2 cents. Thank you.
Well, we have an interesting concept here. Obviously, when we start talking about parking, yes or no, and bicycles, yes or no, it may change the conversation. But right now, you know, we've been talking about this through lane being 10 foot, 11 foot, or 12 foot. And obviously, in the 1A scenario, 10, 11, or 12 would work, because it would you would take 1 or 2 extra feet from the 7 foot area here. And it would not impact or minimize the sidewalk area there. You can also see from 1B that if 10 foot went to 11 or 12 feet, you could still have a bicycle rack, bicycle lane, but the pedestrian way would not be 10 feet. It would still be 8 feet, so that it adds up. Again, if this became 10, 11, or 12, this could be reduced from 10 to 9 to 8. So there's different scenarios there. So perhaps when we get to bike lanes and parking, that might change people's feelings on that. Jen Burton, did you have
Yes, hi.
Jenny?
Yes, I do want to make a comment. Just looking at this, I feel like we should maybe suggest for them the designers to break down these streets into like 4 quadrants. So treat the west end of Baltimore Avenue and Wilmington Avenue completely different than how we treat the area in front of Eden and, you know, Jam, because when you're looking at this and you're saying, okay, we're going to do this, the pedestrian space as well as the car space exactly the same all the way through to the 2 blocks, it really doesn't work, because honestly, just being on Baltimore Avenue with all the trucks and as many restaurants as we have on the 2nd block, when you have a Cisco truck and a liquor store truck and all of that together, I mean, it becomes gridlocked when you have parking. So I would suggest not even having parking, just like Frank said, at the west end of Baltimore Avenue, but maybe do different parking more in the 1st block where you get more cars parked, where it could be angled pull in, whereas on Baltimore at the west end, there would be none. And then maybe in the middle of Baltimore Avenue on the 2nd block would be parallel. So I feel like we should treat these streets a little different because of the widths are so varying. And I don't think that we should pick like a schematic and just say, okay, we're going to do a 10-foot drive through or 20 feet of driving on both blocks. And this meant this many feet for pedestrian throughout the whole 2 blocks.
Well, I think that might be a good point, Jenny, that we could pause on. The way I looked at this and the concepts in front of us, I was looking at primarily the 2nd block of Wilmington and the 2nd block of Baltimore, because I had questions on how they were applied to the 1st block. I believe the intention would be, and I need help here, I believe the intention of Rossi is to include this schematic from Second Street all the way to the boardwalk. And why I came up with that is that if you look at the color aerials, it shows that it to be the same width beginning to end. And I'm not sure I'm 100% comfortable with that. I like the way that it fans out now. I think there's a need for it to fan out so that it can accommodate delivery trucks and making U-turns, because that is the difference between second block and first block, is the first block is a dead-end street. So is that how you?
No, I think, Mayor, I think the intent is that Rossi gave us the schematics of these various widths and the existing conditions, and then those various options. And it's this group's job to then say, second block of Baltimore, we want it 10 feet wide travel lane, no parking, and a bike path. And maybe it only goes to the mid block, but I think in general, we would think of it as a block, but it may transition in between because the road widths vary, as you said. But I think that's the role of the task force, to say, okay, Baltimore from second to first, at the Second Street end, we need to remove parking to make the turn, or parking on one side, or larger sidewalks. That I think is the role of the task force to come back.
I think we need to focus right now on the individual concepts per block, and let's start with the second block of Baltimore, because the first block might be entirely different.
I think there will be.
Yeah.
I think they've said that, several times.
Right.
It's not one size fits all, because each of those blocks are unique and different.
Well, the first block of Baltimore utilizes a different type of parking, angled parking. And personally, when we get to that, I am probably fine with taking the concept we choose for the second block of Baltimore and letting it fan out naturally in the first block. Any further comment? Frank Cooper?
Yes, one element that I don't see in any of these schematics is bicycle parking. And my idea of a wider sidewalk, one of the reasons I advocate that is that there would be places to park, to put bike tie-ups along the sidewalk in front of the various businesses, rather than having them grouped at one end of the street or not. I think people want to use their bicycles the same way they walk to things. They want to go to a restaurant, to a store, they want to park out front. And so I think that part of the space here for sidewalks could also encompass some bicycle parking, which I think is a bigger issue than the actual coming and going of bicycles.
I don't disagree. I'm not sure at what point we get into the details. By example, if we look at some of these samples here, if we went with 1A, we've got this no man's land that could definitely be bump outs or a 15-foot wide sidewalk if we wanted. If we went with 1B, where we've got bike lanes and through lane, we've got a 10-foot pedestrian path that could accommodate bicycle storage areas. Here, you've got concept 2 with parking. That doesn't mean parking has to be continuous from beginning to end of the street. It could be that you have 4 spaces and then a double bump out, then 6 spaces and another bump out. For me, these bump outs could be sitting areas. They could be dining areas. They could be transformers. They could be lights or 5G antenna. They could be trees, bicycle stations, and scooter parking. So we've got a lot of those areas that I think that we can accommodate, and it just has to be part of our thinking and our planning. Anybody else?
Mayor, this is Howard Menaker again.
Yes, Howard.
I guess what I'm struggling with is that in trying to determine the width of the travel lanes, we almost have to consider at the same time what else goes in that block. And I think Jenny Burton's comment about the fact that the second block of Baltimore is entirely different from the first is a good example of that. For instance, if we were to suggest that we not have bike lanes in the second block of Baltimore Avenue. So if you go back to their concept 1B and you take out 10 feet of bike lane, then you could expand both the circulation, the pedestrian, the sidewalks, and the travel lanes. And from what I've heard, no bike lanes seems to be a direction we're heading. If we can make that decision, that gives us a lot of leeway. And then I would suggest, and I may be way ahead of the discussion, and for that I apologize, but I suggest that when we talk about the ocean blocks of Baltimore and Wilmington, because they're so wide, we talk about a whole different set of options, including some sort of feeder pedestrian facility, something like that, as people come off the boardwalk, because that seems to be a point that's been raised in this committee. But as I say, I don't think we can determine the travel lane width until we know whether we would suggest there be a bike lane or not.
Thank you, Howard. That's a good point. Of course, next on my outline is determination of the extent of bicycle accommodations. So that's where we're headed. I do want to let everybody have their say-so on travel lanes before we move to that. And you also mentioned something about the boardwalk to Baltimore or Wilmington connection. As I mentioned earlier, I'm really not intending don't expect a lot of discussion on undergrounding. I also don't expect any conversation yet on limited vehicle access zones, nor the connection of Baltimore and Wilmington to the boardwalk. They're coming up, but we've got greater homework to do at the beginning. Is there any further conversation on travel lanes? I think this is going to morph into different things as we discuss each component, and then we'll obviously come back to travel lanes at some point. Anybody else?
Yes, Mayor. Randy Haney.
Yes, Randy.
Being that we're on Baltimore, I kind of concur with Jenny. The 9-foot lanes are working, maybe not the best in the world, but the biggest issue I think is we would be slightly wider sidewalks, utilizing some parking. We may have to eliminate some parking. And if we eliminated the first couple of parking spaces at the 2nd Street end, we would eliminate that turning problem we have down there. And if the streets were actually striped, I think the delivery trucks would not park in the middle of the street where the street gets completely blocked off. So there's, but I think the wide, especially at our end of the street, the sidewalks are very narrow. You have people that basically, you have a stroller and a family and you can't get around them. I mean, so I think the pedestrian traffic is probably a bit bigger consideration. Bicycles are going to work with the traffic. I don't see where putting bike lanes in are going to accomplish anything at this point.
Thank you, Randy. So you mentioned parking. We'll get that into a minute, but if nobody else has anything to say on travel lanes, let's go ahead and segue into bicycle. Frank, you have one more comment on travel lanes?
And Dr. Trejos's letter, he was talking about eliminating the turn lanes on 1st Street. I only bring that up as a possible solution to total number of parking spaces. And I mean, nobody really wants to lose parking spaces, but there's a lot of other things that we've talked about here that we'd like to do with space. And I kind of agree with him on that, and those spaces could be added to our total number of parking spaces. In other words, kind of move the cars over there and off of 1st Street and Wilmington. So.
Thank you, Frank. That'll come up when we get directly on talking about North 1st Street, South 1st Street. Thank you very much. Before we get off the travel lane width, I'd like to go to our staff. Chief Banks is here. Chief, do you have, I know you've studied all the issues. Would appreciate your input.
Yeah, thank you. I like the concept as far as having some parking, and with some bump outs, as you kind of mentioned a little bit earlier, Mayor. But as far as the width, definitely needs to be at least 10 foot. I would push maybe to 11, and that still would maybe be able to widen the sidewalk. As it's been mentioned, the sidewalks in several areas, the second block is not very wide there. But at the end of the day, trucks are getting bigger, not just delivery vehicles, just people are driving bigger vehicles, and the mirrors stick out. And that's what we're seeing on First Street when we get to that. So I don't know how we eliminate that unless we really step up enforcement if vehicles are outside parking spaces and all. So definitely, I don't think we can go any smaller than 10 foot, but I would probably recommend 11.
All right.
Because what I have seen already in the Lake Avenue, I have received some calls or whatever and beeping of horns where bicyclists aren't moving over because they don't feel safe or whatever, because the cars are on both sides, and so vehicles are moving slower behind them and beeping the horn and things. And so I think it's going to happen. You're going to have that congestion. So I think 11 foot is what I'm more comfortable with.
All right. So we've got varied opinions, including from the chief, to go from 10 to 11 to 12 feet. We can pass that on to Rossi. We'll come back to it because it may change with talking about bike lanes and parking. But also, I think we can be mindful that even if it could only be 10 foot within 100 feet or so of Second Street, it very likely could flare out to accommodate 11 and 12 foot plus lanes as you approach First Street and then get from First Street toward the boardwalk area. Last call for any comments on through lanes. If not, let's go ahead on. Again, these are all introductory discussions. I'm very appreciative of everybody doing their homework and commenting. Let's move on to determination of the extent of bicycle accommodations. If you recall, let me pull up something here. Oh. This is in your original presentation by Rossi. They call them bike facilities. They talked about two methodologies there. Of course, one would be doing nothing. The other methodologies would be having a shared roadway, which is a through lane plus a striped shoulder, designated by bike route signs and provide continuity to the other bicycle routes or designated preferred route. And then the other option is to go with the dedicated bike lanes established where there is significant bicycle demand. I made note of that. Significant bicycle demand warrants bicycle lanes. And then pavement marking and signing along street and everything. So I think the shared roadway would what? That would be helpful, wouldn't it? I apologize. I could see it on my screen. This is page 13 of your original packet there. I assume that the shared roadway would be where the bicycles use the through lane, and there would be sharrows in the middle of the lane. Is that what the intention is? Whereas the bike lane would be dedicated bike lanes with a stripe on each side and a bicycle symbol in the middle. So going back to our B, again, just right now, focusing primarily, say, on the second block of Baltimore. If we liked bicycle lanes, that might be concept 1B. So I know we covered some of it last time. Is this shared screen again?
Mayor, this is Pat Caluzzi. I thought we had decided that, or maybe I'm wrong, that we agreed that bicycle lanes probably would not be a great solution for either Wilmington or Baltimore. I
Well,
thought that,
Pat, I believe it was discussed, but we have made no decision. So,
okay,
I think it warrants additional conversation because not everybody spoke up. A very few handful did. And I think this is the opportunity for let everybody speak up. Those who spoke at the beginning can certainly reiterate your point. But again, last meeting, was just an introductory, talk about that. So go ahead, Pat. You got any,
no,
further ideas to share?
I think Frank Cooper presented this last time and also made comment, I believe, a little bit earlier today. I agree that the traffic is slow enough on both Wilmington and Baltimore that it does not warrant bicycle lanes. So not to mention the space is just at a premium there. So I would say, in my opinion, we would have just sharrows and they would have to share with the cars. But I do agree that more, I don't know what to call it, but bicycle racks, not racks per se, but some way of having bicycles able to park along the both avenues without having to go to one spot at one end or the other might be helpful. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. Frank Cooper.
Yes, I was under the impression that we had all sort of nixed the idea of bicycle lanes. I don't hear any proponents of it. And I would be the one who would be. But parking, I think, for bicycles is a much bigger issue. Also, I'd like to agree with Pat that the idea of the sharrow, I think, is a good one, is to, and kind of addresses some of the things that Keith Banks was talking about, is there's going to be a natural conflict between automobiles and bicycles, and that's kind of the life in the big city. I do think the sharrow kind of makes the emphasis to the drivers that you're going to have to slow down and live with the bicycles, and that it's not a significant change from the way things are now just because of the volume of cars and people parallel parking and things. It's slow, and it's going to be slow. But I think the sharrows kind of make are a big deal without going overboard with them. I think you also have to look at the aesthetics of this too, which is my biggest thing. And the bicycle lanes are not attractive. A lot of lines in the street are a lot of clutter. It's going to make everything seem more cloistered and claustrophobic. I mean, when things are, are so many lines and stuff painted in the street, I don't think it's an attractive solution. And I think one of the biggest things we're trying to do here is make this town attractive. So I would suggest that we just sort of poll everybody on the bicycle lane thing and kind of get that out of the way, because I don't think it's going to fly anywhere on Wilmington or Baltimore Avenue. Thank you.
Well, let's give others the opportunity to express their opinions first, Frank. Frank Cole, do you want to reiterate anything from your last comments at the last meeting before we go to anybody new?
I would agree generally with Frank Cooper. I don't see the application of bike lanes on the first block of Baltimore or Wilmington Avenue. And unfortunately, I think the second block of Baltimore Avenue in particular is a little bit too narrow to entertain a bike path there. So that leaves the second block of Wilmington Avenue as possibly viable, but what's the point if you don't really have any continuity? So I would tend to agree with Frank Cooper. My overall opinion is that wider streets are what is best for cyclists, not only for cyclists to deal with cars coming up behind them and everything, but also one of the big issues is, as everybody who parks in town knows, sometimes it can be very difficult to back out of a parking space and be assured that you're not going to back into another car or a pedestrian or a cyclist. So for all those reasons, I would tend to recommend against bike paths on Baltimore or Wilmington.
All right. so
I
far I've heard
agree.
mention first and second blocks of Wilmington and Baltimore. I think we need to address Second Street and First Street as well. You've got North First and Second Street. I think, I'm not sure if it's the CDP, but there's been mention, in the past that the First Street and Second Street are the major north-south routes. Does anybody have opinion on bicycle routing there? Does the same thing apply to your comments that for Baltimore and Wilmington?
Um,
Frank, go ahead. Cooper, go ahead.
Yeah, you know, First Street is a kind of a different situation in the sense that it is a through corridor. And I actually think that there's more bicycle traffic there from people heading from South Rehoboth and downtown to North Rehoboth. But there again, the space is so tight that I can't see putting bicycle lanes in unless you eliminate parking. And I don't think there's any appetite for that. So it would be more serve a better purpose there where there's definitely conflict, but particularly south of Rehoboth Avenue is really narrow, and it's tough for bicyclists there. There again, I think really the sharrows, to make it clear to vehicular traffic that they're just going to have to slow down and wait for the bikes. And that's kind of the way it is. But I don't think that there's room for bicycle lanes without eliminating parking, and I doubt there's any appetite for that. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else, pro or con bicycles? Now's your chance to speak up.
Mayor, this is Howard Menaker.
Yes, Howard.
I respect the opinions of those who bike a lot more than I do and who serve the people who bike. So I just want to add my support to the concept that on Baltimore, Wilmington, First and Second, that we not go with bike lanes, but instead work with a sharrow system of sharing the traffic lanes with cars and bicycles in all cases.
Okay. Anybody else? Chief, do you have, you want to say anything on bicycle lanes?
No, I think I agree with that with the bicycle. When it comes to bicycle, I have some other comments when we get to the turn lanes.
Okay, very good. Patty, go ahead.
Yeah, I totally agree. I don't think there's enough room for bike lanes. Being on North First Street, I don't know if it's major signage then, something to make the cars aware of the bikes. I see every single day people opening their car doors and hitting bikers, falling on the ground, people trying to pass bikers and stuff like that. So I agree, no bike lanes, but I'm also not sure, how do you handle the problem of, people getting hurt?
Thank you, Patty. Anybody else? We'll move on to extent of parking on the street. Do we want parking allowed on one side or both sides? Do we want some hybrid parking, such as Baltimore, no parking closest to Second Street, but parking the rest of the street on both sides? And then a separate topic would be elimination of parallel parking on the west side of North First Street. So just parking in general. And again, you can start, use the concept 1A, 1B, and 2 as a foundation for discussion. Anybody?
Mayor, Pat Calusi here.
Yes.
So have we decided that bike lanes are, at this point, are we going to take a vote on that? Or are we just going to move ahead and talk about parking without knowing whether or not bike lanes are going to be an option?
Well, I really wanted to vote formally at the next meeting to allow others time for their input and to absorb everything. I think you can see what the consensus is. So I would just go with that assumption that there's not going to be any bicycle lanes, and let's go into discussing parking.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mayor,
You got any?
this is Jenny. Mayor, this is Jenny Burton.
Jenny.
I feel like, again, you know, the east side of Baltimore Avenue and Wilmington Avenue, when it comes to parking, is completely different than the west side on both of those streets. Whereas I feel like in the schematics, if we're gonna just pick a concept to be the design of this project for the whole 2 blocks, I just feel like as a group, it's really hard to make a decision on that because I feel like you could have slanted parking and a lot more parking in the first block on both streets. Whereas in the second block, you've got all kinds of driveways. You have, you know, we'd love to have more area for outside dining. So you want like a little bit wider sidewalks. We have residents, it's just 2 completely different deals when it comes to breaking these down. But if you're asking us as a group to make a decision on a concept that we've been presented, I think it's difficult.
Jenny, I don't disagree with you. I think what we need to, I believe how we should best approach this is that for our group today, to focus on the second blocks of Baltimore and Wilmington rather than the first blocks. And then we can see if we can realize your request to get some additional schematics showing what the first blocks of Wilmington could be, whether it's up near First Street, mid-block, and even toward the boardwalk. So let's focus on, try to keep it narrow right now on the second block of Baltimore and the second block of Wilmington.
Mr. Mayor?
Joe Baker, yes, sir.
Yeah, I think for the second blocks, we should consider the options with parking because, you know, we also have to, we're thinking about the busiest season and the most congested times, but we also have to think about the other 7 months of the year. And if we're trying to attract people into our restaurants and businesses, you know, the more parking, the better. And I think that obviously there's going to have to be, you know, if we're adding in some bump outs or having to eliminate for the ends of the streets, I think that's fine. But I would just move to say that we should still consider having parking on both those blocks.
Thank you, Joe. Anybody else? Right now, I'm a fan of parking. I don't like to lose a lot of parking spaces, and I think we have the potential to lose a good number, for instance, on North First Street. But I like the parking right now, and for some of the reasons I stated earlier, that it doesn't necessarily need to be continuous parking. You can have those bump outs for, as I mentioned before, trees, sitting areas, transformers, lights, bike stations, scooter parking, things like that. And I think that could be accommodated very well and still achieve a reasonably wide pedestrian circulation path.
Mayor, this is Howard Menaker.
Yes, Howard.
Yeah, again, operating as a general concept, and as we all know, the devil's in the details. But if we're talking about Baltimore and Wilmington right now, I would suggest that we favor a concept that allows for parking on both sides of the second block of Baltimore and Wilmington, understanding that that may not be possible in every foot of the lineage or the street. And I would definitely say that we need to do more work, but as a general concept, leave the concept of slanted head-in parking in the first blocks of Baltimore and Wilmington.
Yeah, I would agree. I do want to point out the negative in what you and I both just said. Looking at concept 2 for Baltimore Avenue, this again would be a concept 2 for Wilmington and Baltimore Avenue, second block. You know, it has a minimum of 8-foot parking two 10-foot through lanes only yields us 7-foot pedestrian circulation path, which is 1 foot less than the desired circulation path. But there's no way that we can gain more space to widen those through lanes from 10 to 11 to 12 feet. So parking, if we determine to go parking, it limits us what we can do in our through lanes and our pedestrian circulation path. Anybody else?
Mayor, it's Edward. I'm gonna, I agree with you and Howard. And one thing I want to point out is we've got, if we've got the 10-foot through lanes on streets like Baltimore and Wilmington, it's not constant that there's cars on both through lanes at the same time. Oftentimes cars are riding more in the middle of the street and using more than a 10-foot through lane. And then another car is passing by and they move back into the through lane or go around a delivery truck. So it's a little different than streets that are a little bit more congested and have constant traffic.
Thank you, Ed. And as I mentioned before, that 10-foot through lane is very likely the minimum up towards 2nd Street. And because the road width funnels out toward 1st Street and toward the boardwalk. So it could be that the 10-foot is only up to mid-block, and then it goes to 11-foot and then 12-foot. So we could still maybe accomplish what our desire is to maximize the width of the through lane. Any other comments?
Yes, Mayor, Frank Cooper.
Frank Cooper, go ahead.
I am kind of for keeping the travel lanes narrower, right? Where, especially where towards 2nd Street, where it's already narrow now, and we've been living with that. I mean, I would opt for widening the sidewalks as opposed to widening. As the flare goes up towards 1st Street, I would opt for widening the sidewalks as opposed to the travel lanes. I mean, maybe we're at 9 feet wide only as we are now. The current is only 9 feet at 2nd Street, which is kind of narrow and it's difficult. But if we move the parking back a little bit, we can accommodate large vehicles, and then flare up to 10 feet where there's enough room to do that. But I wouldn't keep going and making it like 11 feet or 12 feet just because you can. I think that space should be allocated to the sidewalks. As pointed out in front of Blue Moon and stuff, things are tight there. And there's people hanging around on the sidewalks at places like that. And you have the same thing on Wilmington Avenue in front of Henlope and Oyster House and Salt Air and stuff. There are people waiting for tables in those restaurants, and they congregate on the sidewalk. So I really think the sidewalk traffic is what we should be focusing on as opposed to travel lanes. Thank you.
Mr.
Joe
Mayor.
Baker. Yes, sir.
Is there an option to, at the narrowest part, if we're still discussing the 2nd blocks of Wilmington and Baltimore, is there an option at the narrowest part that we could consider that maybe would eliminate parking on one side of the street to enable to kind of, because if maybe I'm wrong, but I feel like the streets flare out even a little bit as they get towards 2nd Street.
I do.
To kind of graduate that up to be able to have a little bit of a wider path and more of an easement than having just uniform parking on both sides of the street or not.
Oh, I think so. We've talked about that for the west end of Baltimore, and I think it would be equally applicable to the west end of Wilmington, Joe. Anybody else?
Mayor Howard Miniker again.
Yes, sir.
I think Joe Baker has a really strong point, and I think that I guess this goes back to Jenny Burton's point about the fact that adopting one schematic for an entire street, or in this case, even for an entire block, may not be where we want to go. So I would suggest that as a working concept, we ask Rossi to give us a proposal or a schematic, keeping the 10-foot travel lanes all the way down the first or the second block of Baltimore and Wilmington, but then seeing if we can expand out the pedestrian areas and still leave room for parking, or whether we need to take parking out on one side of the street in order to accomplish that.
Okay.
Mayor, I'm sure it's on your radar, but we've gone through a few topics. I'd really like to hear from the public.
Okay, we'll do that next. Frank Cooper?
Yes, and I'm all for, we're focusing on the first block, and the second blocks of Wilmington and Baltimore. But as Ms. Burden pointed out, that all of this is different, almost foot by foot down these two streets. And there may be ideas where in the first block, there's opportunity for more parking as opposed to less parking. So I think you have to look at the parking holistically and think, okay, we're going to eliminate parking here, but maybe we can add some there, because I don't think there's generally any appetite for losing a lot of parking spaces. But we could shuffle things around maybe and widen the sidewalks where we need it and park more cars where the travel lanes are really wide. Up in the first block, they're kind of a lot wider than they need to be, really. And there might be more opportunity for parking there. That's all.
Thank you. Any other members? If not, we will take a pause and go to the members of the public. Your topics would be the width of the travel lane, if you like, determination of bicycle accommodations and facilities, if you like, and extent of parking on the street. Those are the only topics that we're entertaining right at this moment. Please understand that as we received your correspondence from Mr. Strange and Dr. Trejos, it was passed on to the members, also embedded in the agenda for public consumption. So you need perhaps not go into deep detail on that, and can focus on new topics or new comments. With that, we're going to go to Mike Strange and Rick Perry, and then Dr. Trejos. Mike Strange, are you there?
Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead, Mike.
Yes, actually, I'll make my comments very quick with regard to those specific topics. Ms. Burton's observations, along with Mr. Cooper's, are absolutely correct in that you have to look at these four streets independently of each other and then aggregate the impact together. To do otherwise, you're going to end up coming up with unacceptable solutions, quite frankly. The other part is, which I think is critical with regard to the issue with regard to the widths and some other issues, is although, Mr. Mayor, you've commented you want to lock these down, it's going to have to be an iterative process as you go through the other steps in this, to use Mr. Cooper's language of a holistic process, and revisit this again. As you make all those decisions on each individual block. But it is absolutely critical from a urban planning standpoint to evaluate these individually. The other part is Mr. Baker's comment on parking. I would observe that I think there's a misunderstanding here as to what the objective is of what you want to achieve in these four streets. Is that if you were to get a 10 or 20 or 30% increase in the amount of physical people going into your businesses, but at the cost of losing 2 or 3 parking spaces, I think that would be a trade-off you'd love to have. So I think you should take into context what you're trying to achieve. And in particular, in the ocean blocks with the boardwalk, those are dead-end streets. It just turns out that the terminus is one of the most critical avenues in the city. That's all my comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Rick Perry, are you on board? No? Rick's not on. Dr. Trejos, are you available?
Yes, good morning, Mayor, and thank you, everyone. I would like to make a notation first off with regard to the three concepts, 1A, 1B, and 2. I believe that it's from hearing the consensus here, pretty much we've eliminated concept 1B, which would be the bike lanes. And I believe we should potentially continue to focus only on 1A and concept 2 and pretty much eliminate 1B. That's regarding the bicycle lanes. Regarding the second blocks of both Wilmington and Baltimore, and in particular focusing on Wilmington, I totally concur with Joe Baker and Frank Cooper with regard to the issue of the significant bottleneck that's occurring at the far west end of the second block of Wilmington Avenue. I traverse that intersection quite frequently, and it can be very much of a interesting encounter trying to make a turn when other people are trying to turn in. And Joe Baker's viewpoint that potentially by eliminating parking on one side and therefore eliminating that bottleneck could actually significantly improve the desire of people to turn into that street, therefore dovetailing Michael Strain's point that by potentially eliminating parking or concurring with eliminating parking on one side of the roadway could indeed therefore improve and increase traffic flow and therefore increase commerce flow into the second block of Wilmington Avenue. And thank you much.
Thank you, Doctor. We'll call on you again later. Hopefully you can get on with us. Appreciate it. Back to the members. Any further comment on parking in terms of the at least the second blocks of Baltimore and Wilmington? Chief, you have nothing you want to say?
No, I would just agree with Dr. Chia and some others that said about the parking. I think we need parking on the second blocks of Wilmington and Baltimore Avenue, but because of the bottleneck at the intersection on West End, we may need to eliminate it on one side or at least take a look at it. And I think we've talked about either eliminating or making sure there's no parking available and there'll be a bump out or something that's smaller. So I think I'm in line with everyone else.
Thank you, Chief. So one of the other considerations is elimination of parallel parking on the west side of North First Street per the comprehensive development plan. Are there any thoughts on that? You know, North First Street has a turn lane closest to where the McDonald's used to be. What is that? The northwest corner of Rehoboth and First Street. There's a turn lane there. Beyond that, half the block is parking on the west side. And then on the other block of North First Street from Baltimore to Maryland, there's full parking on both the east and west sides. Does anybody have a flavor for any of that? Frank Cole?
Yeah, Mr. Mayor. With respect to the area between Baltimore Avenue and Maryland Avenue on the west side of First Street, that is a bottleneck, and it's been identified in numerous committees as a friction point for bicyclists in particular, because it's very narrow there. Also, from another safety standpoint, the parking spot and the sidewalk, the area of private property that abuts to the street there, has been in a state of disrepair for a long time. And I would recommend that section be addressed during the streetscape process in the interest of safety. But I hesitate to, as your last couple of commenters mentioned, to eliminate parking. I think you're on the right track with your desire to preserve as many parking spaces as possible. And along those lines, I think we should maybe discuss what would be acceptable as far as a net loss of parking space. Not to change the subject, but I agree with Dr. Trejos and the other saying that the area on the west, the western end of Wilmington Avenue at the intersection with 2nd Street is also a problem area that should be addressed. And if there's a net loss of 1 or 2 parking spaces, I think most of the people on this committee would be okay with that. That's it.
Thank you, Frank. Anybody else?
Yeah, Mayor, I agree with all that's been said, especially with Mr. Strange. You know, I certainly don't want to lose, or I want to preserve as many parking spots as we can, but certainly on the west end of Baltimore and Wilmington, we're going to need to lose 1 or 2, just so it doesn't bottleneck, just so it's safer for people to turn. Same is true at the intersections of at least Baltimore. I don't know the same is true at First and Wilmington, but First in Baltimore, if you're going eastbound trying to turn left, with that parking spot on the west side of North First, it's hard to see oncoming traffic and vehicles if you're making that left turn. I think for safety reasons, we're going to need to lose a space or 2 at some of those intersections. But generally speaking, I think we need to preserve as many parking spots as we can.
Thank you, Ed. Anybody else?
Mayor, this is Howard Menaker. Along that point, if for our next meeting, if you could have city staff give us the count of how many parking spaces currently exist along these blocks that we're considering. And then I think we can begin to take a look, because to my eye, and again, I'm not a trained engineer here, but to my eye, there may be room to eliminate a few spaces on First Street, but add them in on Second Street or something to that effect, which goes back to the earlier point about taking this as a holistic concept.
Thank you. Thank you, Howard. We'll look at number of parking spaces. I believe you may be able to find that information in a PowerPoint presentation I did at the first, second, or third meetings, but we'll grab that information again to let everybody know. While we're on First Street, we want to take a look at turning lanes and the configuration. Chief, I think you had some comments, and Dr. Trejos had comments on turning lanes. Dr. Trejos, are you still on board? We'll go to the public first. Mike Strange, do you have any comments on turning lanes as far as First Street?
Not at the moment, because it really is going to be a function of your other decisions to try to figure out if in fact some additional work needs to be done in that area. Thank you.
Correct. Thank you. Dr. Trejos, are you on yet?
Yes, I'm on. And forgive me, what topic are we speaking of right away?
First, we're still on First Street talking about the lane configuration and specifically turning lanes.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Mayor. As I stated in my presentation, I made a notation that turning lanes really were unnecessary, either northbound on First Street to Wilmington or southbound at First Street to Baltimore. I really feel that those turning lanes were not necessary because of the heaviness of the flow of traffic. So I would prefer that those turning lanes not exist. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. And Rick Perry's still not on? Nope. So we have a rebuttal there, I think, by Chief Banks, a little different perspective as far as turn lanes. I'd like him to share that with us, please.
Yeah, my concern is just there's so much heavy traffic, vehicle and bicycle, people crossing there and turning, and I would not like to see that turn lane made into parking spaces. I know we're always looking for parking spaces, but again, it's so skinny and well traveled there. It's not very wide in those streets areas. You take on the south side, First Street Station right now, there's no parking, and I would not, and it's sort of a turn lane. And I would not like to start seeing parking go in there because it is tight. I know right now when you're making the right turn to head south, again, with vehicles that are where the old frog pond was, it's just you have to cross over the center lane line because cars are sticking out of the parking spaces. It's so small. So I would not like, I'm concerned if we eliminate the turn lanes that we'd want to try to put parking spaces in there. So if we did eliminate the turns, I wouldn't like to see anything else go in its place. If that makes sense. It's just too much traffic in that area.
So we're looking at concept 2, would have a turn lane, 2 through lanes, and then parking. As a possibility.
Mayor,
I don't think you're going to have. I see the concept too, but with parking, but I don't think that's really accurate.
Eliminate.
That's a tight fit.
Eliminate the parking. Well, I mean, if we went with concept 2, you can see what it does. The sidewalk is very narrow, and the only way to widen that would be to eliminate parking. Somebody had a hand up?
yes.
Randy, go ahead.
Yeah, 2 comments. The turn lanes, as you turn, I guess, right onto Rehoboth coming out of First Street, going south by what you call the old McDonald's. That's almost a necessity because I think otherwise, with people crossing the street and everything, you're just going to back traffic up down First Street because they're going to be waiting for people. You're going to have no cars going straight across because everybody's going to be waiting for the car to make the right turn onto Rehoboth Avenue while people are crossing the street. So I think you almost need, I know it's not a large turn lane there. It's not terribly long, but it does help with that congestion issue. My other comment, and we didn't talk about this, is the crosswalks at the end of Baltimore and First. There was some talk a while back about making that a 4-way stop to allow better pedestrian flow. And also, I think what Edward was talking about was, difficulty seeing coming out of those streets. So I didn't know if that's something we should maybe discuss in this planning too. And that could be the same thing at Wilmington First, an issue there also.
That's something we'll put to the chief and get Rossi's recommendations on also. Thank you, Randy. Appreciate it. Any other comments on specifically on North First Street or South First Street? Does anybody have any comments on elimination of all the parking on North First Street in areas either from Rehoboth Avenue to Baltimore and or Baltimore to Maryland? Frank Cooper, did you had your hand up?
I doubt that there's going to be any appetite for removing the parking on one whole side of the street there. It would be nice. I mean, we could use the space, but honestly, there's little appetite for eliminating parking spaces. And so as bad as it is, that's a lot of parking spaces, and it's certainly in prime territory for the businesses. And it's been pointed out in the off season that becomes even more important. Also, the turn lane, I would suggest that turn lane at First Street and Rehoboth Avenue is seldom used properly. I mean, I'm there a lot, and the cars don't even really get over into it. They don't even realize it's a turn lane. It's so short. So I don't think it's very effective. I mean, in concept, I understand what Chief Banks is saying, and Haney is saying that, it should eliminate some backup there because there's a lot of pedestrians crossing, preventing right-hand turns. But the reality is that the cars seldom get over far enough that people can go around them anyway. So, and there's not that much traffic going all the way across. I mean, most of the cars coming out of there are going to the right. So anyway, my 2 cents.
Thank you. Anything else on, First Street? Comments? We've got, Second Street. You can see it's a much different concept. There's no parking at all.
Mr. Mayor,
Yes, yes, Elise.
it's Elise Moore. I would respectfully, I just think maybe looking at eliminating parking on one side on First Street could really invite people who are on Rehoboth Avenue. There might be a way to sort of invite them over to Baltimore and over to Wilmington if there was less parking there. Should it be possible to make up for some of those spaces on maybe possibly the first block of Baltimore and Wilmington? Just because it would just take away from the clutter. We could have signs. I mean, aesthetically and pedestrian wise, it might be a good idea if not too many parking spaces were eliminated.
Thank you, Elise. I'm giving similar thought. If we go back to our one diagram here on First Street that accommodates parking on, let's see, parking on one side. Actually, there's a turn lane or parking on the other side, but look what it does to the width of the pedestrian circulation path. I can't read what it says. 5.5 feet, which is way under our minimum. Compare that with the minimum width of the pedestrian circulation to Second Street, where you've only got 3 through lanes, no parking, and look, all of a sudden the pedestrian circulation path is 9 feet, almost double what it is on First Street. I'm giving a lot of weight to how we achieve an optimum size sidewalk area, pedestrian path.
Mayor, I thank Elise for bringing that point up, and Mr. Strange made a point earlier that I think is very important, and that is the goal here is to get more pedestrians to these streets, make it safer and easier and more inviting for them. And if we happen to lose a parking spot to dozens more people, foot traffic around the businesses, it's still a net gain for the business, although losing a parking spot isn't great, but the objective is to get more people to come to these streets in a more inviting and safe way. So I just want to reiterate that point that Elise and Mr. Strange made.
Thank you, Ed. And of course, my point was I prefer wider sidewalks for the exact reason you stated, but also that I stated earlier, the invitation factor, getting people off of Rehoboth Avenue to cross to Baltimore or to Wilmington. And I think you need to have wide, inviting sidewalks to be able to do that.
Mayor?
Frank Cooper, yes, sir.
Yes, Mayor, if the businesses that are along there are okay with losing those parking spaces, then I'm all for it. My concern generally is with their concern, as opposed to the idea, your idea of the wider sidewalks there, your and Ed's idea there. I would absolutely favor that if it didn't have an adverse, if it was not perceived to have an adverse effect on the businesses that are along there. Thank you.
Mayor?
Thank you, Frank. Who's next?
Howard Menaker.
Howard, go ahead, Howard.
Yes, Mayor. I think the point that's been raised and that you and I believe Elise have both discussed is one that bears a lot of examination, because I think it's possibly a good solution, which is to eliminate parking on one side of First Street.
Retail, please.
And if we do that, then I think we can expand those pedestrian walkways, the sidewalks, to a width that we all think would be far preferable. And then none of the scenarios given to us by Rossi on Second Street show any parking at all. And so I think we could perhaps put some parking in to part of Second Street. They envision a turn lane, but the turn lane certainly doesn't have to go the whole extension of the whole length of Second Street. So I think there is a lot to be said for taking parking out of one side of First Street and putting it somewhere along Second Street.
All right, thank you, Howard. Any other comments?
Mayor, I have a question, I guess a point of clarification. When we're talking about Second Street, we are not talking about North Second Street, only South Second Street. Is that right?
Correct. We're talking about the South Second Street section between Rehoboth Avenue and Christian Street or Delaware Avenue.
Mr. Mayor?
Yes.
Frank Gold. As someone who has a business on North First Street between Baltimore and Maryland, I think I see those parking spots being utilized a lot, and it's probably 50-50 right off the top of my head. People who are going to Rehoboth Avenue versus people who are frequenting the businesses along First Street there. So with respect to eliminating the parking on North First Street, I would recommend we seek input from some of the other businesses along that street, from Brash and the Cafe A Go Go, the doggy style hot dog stand, Cola's, Lingo's Market, etc. The Double Dippers ice cream store, because I think if you polled them, they might have a slightly different opinion on whether or not they would be in favor of eliminating any parking spaces along North First Street.
Sure. Thank you, Frank. Anything else?
Speaking
I
from
know
somebody.
I know we're not resolving some of these things, but I think it's a great introductory discussion. And we've got a few more things we want to review before we leave today. Patty?
Just speaking from a business on North First Street, extremely concerned about losing any parking over there. I'm between Baltimore and Maryland. You know, the customers are not going to walk down to come to my shop, so it'll hurt. You know, I have an older customer that can't walk very far, and if you eliminate a whole side of the street, it'll be really tough.
Thank you, Patty. If there's no more questions here, we'll go to another subject on my outline: discussion about using the right-of-way only to determine minimum pedestrian circulation route width, or using the face of the building when the facade is set back from the right-of-way property line. Well, let me set this up. One of the things that we're talking about is trying to identify as a minimum optimum pedestrian circulation path or sidewalk area here. This is underneath. There is a good diagram, if I can find it here, page 70, I think. Is this on the screen? Okay, thank you. This was presented by Rossi at the last meeting, draft concept development, right-of-ways versus building facades. Let's set this up. Right now here is North First Street. Here's the Febos, and then next would be Square One, and then next would be Nicola Pizza. And you can see pretty much the facades are all in a row here. The interesting thing is the right-of-way and the property line segregating the city-owned property from private property is about here. And that's illustrated by this drawing here. So it shows, I'm going to guess, a 6-foot width here of city right-of-way sidewalk, and then say 5 foot here. One option I think they're presenting is that could we use this 5 foot to create our minimum sidewalk width and have the curb start all the way over here? And I think, Dr. Trejos, you had, or Mike Strange, either of you all had comments on that. Are you still aboard? We'll let you go first.
Mayor, this is Dr. Treos. I'm available.
Yes, sir.
Mayor, may I continue?
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. As I had placed in my PowerPoint presentation, I had briefly addressed this matter. And ironically, Mayor, it actually dovetails an issue that goes back to the 1990s when you were at that time chairman of the Board of Commissioners when we were dealing with the construction of the boardwalk and the then blowout section of the boardwalk. You may recall back then we had the same issue of private right-of-way issues and the legality associated with that, which to some extent exists today. And what that means is the following. Back then, with the blowout section on the boardwalk, the landlords, as I am, were responsible to construct the blowout section, but the city basically owned it. And then the liability fell onto the landlords should any incident occur as a result of pedestrian traffic on city-owned property, but were the responsibility of the landlords. Similar situation is now occurring here, where there's now being raised potential liability issues for the landlords and the cities, and it would have to be fully determined where the liability would rest if indeed the city was to come into an agreement and to utilize the private right-of-way for city use, and then who would become liable for any injuries or anything that should occur on that city use of that private right-of-way. So obviously there's some legality issues that would have to be addressed, and also contractual arrangements with the property owners. And thank you.
Thank you. As I mentioned at the last meeting, the city secured construction easements on Rehoboth Avenue project when the same situation took place. So the question here is, would the city want to try to accommodate the minimum or optimum sidewalk width by utilizing some of that space? Any comments? Well, I'm leaning toward, go ahead.
Mayor, this is Howard Menaker. In answer to your question, I think it's an absolute yes. I think if we can secure agreements from the private owners, it gives us a lot more of what we want to accomplish in this project by using that for pedestrian right-of-way.
Well, and I agree with you that we would want to do construction easements with the property owner when their facade is set back from the right-of-way or property line, and that we would work out a deal with them to be able to marry our sidewalks with their sidewalk in front, exactly as pictured here. However, I would not want to use, I don't believe I would want to use their dimensions to achieve our minimum sidewalk width. I think that that's their property. They would want perhaps to put dining tables in front of their facade. They may want to put an addition on that property, which they would have a right to up to the property line. So I would not want to, again, utilize some of their front facade dimensions to achieve a minimum pedestrian circulation route. Anybody have other thoughts, similar thoughts?
Mayor Edward here, I completely agree with you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Anybody else?
I've dealt with situations similar to this in Washington, D.C., and there the city leased the land from the owners. Might be an option here.
Well, again, because of the potential for outdoor dining and all that, I would not, and for the owner to renege in the future, I don't think I would favor that at all. So we've gone to the public. Any further comment from the commissioners? Got a couple more things and we'll call it a day. One is discussion about the status of the existing trees. Our staff members here indicated maybe we should have a quick discussion of that. If you recall, the trees on, up and down, let's find a drawing here. Just all the trees up and down all the streets. What's going to happen to them? You know, when we did Lake Avenue Phase 1, that's the streetscape renovation from Bad Hair Day up to Cold Pearl, 3rd Street up to Rehoboth Avenue. You remember we had those large, gorgeous sycamore trees. And we just could not figure a way to do the streetscape project and save those. And so what we did in lieu of that is we put in new trees and bump outs and along the sidewalks there to accommodate that. And so I just wanted to throw that out there. The staff wanted to throw that out there, that most likely these trees would end up succumbing. It's been mentioned that a lot of them are nearing their useful end of their life. And it would be appropriate at this time to do the streetscape renovation and include new trees in there. So maybe this is more of an informational note. Kevin, do you have anything you want to add? No? Any comments or just acknowledgement? So as much as we'd like to save them, we can look at them on an individual basis, but most likely not. Again, because we're digging down into the street. We're digging new curbs, 1.5 foot deep, disturbing their roots. Also, it gives us the opportunity to place new ones exactly where we want them, and also to perhaps consider those tree wells to help protect the roots and keep sidewalks from buckling. Any comments? Frank Cooper, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to point out that removing those trees doesn't mean you have to put saplings back in, that you can reinstall full-size trees with the tree spade. So we don't have to take giant steps backwards here. We can put good-sized trees back in where they belong. And this also reinforces the idea of that undergrounding is so important, because these trees are more threatened by power lines, and cutting back on that, we can never have a nice canopy up high enough. And that's particularly important up in the beach block. I think that there's a lot of businesses there that really don't want trees because it blocks their view of the ocean. And so the canopy needs to be rather high and wispy in order to, and so this is an opportunity really to put trees in a good place and to put good sized trees back in.
Thank you, Frank. Anybody else?
Hi, Mayor, I'd like to
Well,
say
we're gonna-
something.
Yes, go ahead.
Jenny Burton, I just wanted to comment about the trees. The type of trees that are on our property or on the curb of our properties, they've caused problems with the sidewalk cracking, the root system going underneath of our building, the one in front of 33 Baltimore Avenue. We actually had to remove because when we had irrigation put in, the gentleman who was doing the irrigation said we had tree saplings all underneath our building that was causing problems with the structure. So we did get permission from Greg Faris to take it down. We had 2 times where we were sued because someone tripped on the crack. So I just wanted to just make that comment that the types of trees that are on, I'm not against having trees, but the types of trees that are on the area where our property is a huge problem. So I would be in favor of replacing them with something that didn't have such a crazy root system and cause problems with the expense of what we're doing here. Why have the tree when it's going to eventually mess up the sidewalk that we're going to pay for this streetscape?
Mayor.
Thank you, Jenny. With that, we're going to try to conclude here for today, unless anybody else has anything they'd like to bring up on the outline that's embedded in the agenda, schematics, concepts, and notes compiled May 31st by myself. On the outline for discussion today, item number 6, determination of preferred schematics, 1A, 1B, 2, or hybrid for each block. Second block of Baltimore, first block of Baltimore, second block of Wilmington, first block of Wilmington, South Second Street from Rehoboth Avenue to Christian Street, and then First Street, Rehoboth Avenue to Wilmington, Rehoboth Avenue to Baltimore, Baltimore to Maryland. Phew, that's a lot of thinking to do. We have made some progress on some things. I'm going to try to figure out how to get us some additional information. I think diagrams, everybody pretty much has indicated that additional schematics or crosscuts of the first blocks of Wilmington and Baltimore would be helpful. We'll see if we can get that within a week and move forward. So hopefully next weekend we'll actually review all this and see if we can pinpoint some of the schematics. In the meantime, if you all have any questions for me or for Rossi, I would hope you would pass them on. Is there anything else for good of the order, Frank Cooper?
Yeah, Randy Haney was going to comment on the trees, and I was interested in what he was going to say.
Okay, Randy, are you there?
Yes, sir. I was just going to say the same. I can with what Jenny had added, because we've all had problems at our end of the street with trees. We had one fall a couple years ago that the city didn't replace because of, I guess, the upcoming streetscape. Also, probably 7 or 8 years ago, we replaced all our sidewalks at our expense, and they have already buckled because of the trees that are existing there. So the trees are not conducive at this point to the sidewalks that we have. They're probably the wrong type of trees, and also they suffer a lot of wind damage and damage from the elements, because at the time when they were put in, probably many years ago, there was no consideration to what would work with sidewalks, what would work in the windy conditions and that kind of thing. So definitely I don't see a problem with the trees being replaced, but I think we need to also consider what trees are put back, that the right type of trees, that they have the right type of root system that doesn't destroy the sidewalks and that kind of thing. So that was my comment for everyone. Thank you.
Very good. Sorry to skip
that's
over
okay.
you, Randy. Thank you very much.
No, I didn't make a big issue.
Anybody else have anything?
Mr. Mayor, Dr. Treos.
Yes, sir.
I just want to dovetail everybody's comment with regard to the trees, and want to just pose one last thing. When this eventually evolves and trees are going to be replanted, I truly believe that the city should work carefully with both the homeowners and the commercial property owners with regard to the proper location of the trees, so that they are both aesthetically appropriate for the area, but also do not impede upon the commercial operations of those businesses. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. With that, we'll go on to the next item of business, which is new business, reporting any new materials relevant to analysis of schematics. That's my fallback in case anything new came up, since I had to redo do the agenda a week ahead. I don't have anything new to report. And with that, we'll go to, we've had task force comments, citizen comment, review future meeting dates. Wednesday, June 9th at 9 will be the next meeting. I've decided that all the rest of our meetings, since we're a task force and we're have an end date that we'll be working, we'll just conduct our meetings virtual. I'm having a hard time trying to fit in 16 members plus 4 staff members plus additional staff members into the commissioner's room and getting it to work. I find the easiest thing is just to continue with these meetings virtually. So let's put that on our calendar. Hopefully we can finish this next time. If not, we might have to do one more meeting, but the goal would be to finish this next time. If anybody has any notes or suggestions on how best to approach this, please send them to me. I appreciate it. And Ed, you have another comment? Commissioner Sernowski,
Mr. Mayor, I
You're
have something to
muted.
say.
Go ahead. Jenny can go first.
Jenny.
I just wanted to just make a comment about the virtual versus maybe gathering in a big circle in the convention hall and meeting. I think that meeting in person is definitely going to be more effective. I don't know how this group feels about that. But if you've already made your decision for next week to be virtual, I just feel like we need to move forward and not necessarily need to meet in the meeting. In the commissioner's room, but maybe in a big circle in the convention hall.
I don't disagree. I wish we could get together. I can't make it work in the commissioner's room where there are TVs, and I can't make it work in the commissioner or convention hall because of the desire to do it live streamed and share it with everybody and record it. So it just isn't going to work. So we'll do our best, but and you all do very well on camera. Y'all are very photogenic, so thank you. With that, we'll call this meeting adjourned at 10:47 a.m. Thank you very much.